Hello, this is Derek from One Over Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in this episode, I want to get into a whole new type of tea, one that I originally started sourcing back in 2021, so it's been a while. It's been on the site for a long time. I made a YouTube video about it. It's one of the teas on my bucket list. This is Lapsang Souchong, or in Chinese, Zhongshan Shaozhong, or also known as the world's first black tea. It's a really incredible tea that they make up in Tongmuguan, which is really just a stone's throw away from the Wuyi Mountains. This is something I never quite realized until getting out there, and I'm like, oh, it's practically next door to the Wuyi Mountains. And so if you think of Tongmuguan, if you think of Lapsang Souchong, you really should be thinking of Wuyi Yancha, these roasted oolongs from, northwestern Fujian, right on the border of Fujian and Jiangxi. Now, before I get into that, let me just say thank you guys for listening to the last couple episodes. That gives a unique perspective. I did those with Alex, who's been in the One River Tea Cooperative since the genesis. I mean, we started this back in 2017, something like that. Like when we first got to China, we were living in the same city and we had the same ideas of just getting out into the rural mountains, seeing what real Chinese farmers are like, seeing what it is like living on a farm, creating these agricultural goods, especially because there's so much, for that organic push, so much for this romanticization of these lives, of these people in the mountains and these really rural villages. It's really incredible, been a wild trip to see this happen over the past however many years that's been. But yeah, one thing about Alex, though, I don't know if you picked it up from the podcast, he's not really good at, doing the social media, talking about, hyping it up, and really sharing what he's doing. If you look at the One River Tea website, the blog posts, those are mostly Alex. He does so much work creating these academic-styled, informative pieces about what we're doing on the other side of One River Tea. I say the other side because I'm the one who does a lot of the YouTube videos, the Instagram, obviously this podcast, and so you get a lot of my perspective. Alex, though, if you really want his perspective, you have to get on Reddit, you have to get on the Discord, you have to read the blogs on the website. And so I love talking to Alex and just seeing his perspective, because if you were there for the last two episodes, he's very knowledgeable about the people here, about the histories, about really interesting facts about, the local histories of China in general. I think that's one of his specialities. And so, yeah, we talked about Hefeng. We talked about the origin of the chaguan, those tea jars that, everyone's drinking out of in Hubei. That was in the last episode. And then the last episode, we talked about sourcing yellow tea, which was a thing that I wasn't even involved for. I knew we wanted to get out to Junshan because it's one of those top 10 Chinese teas, but I just wasn't able to get the time to go out. And so Alex went out there with Xiaoyan and our new friend Jason, and they were able to source some really cool yellow teas, which hopefully by this time some of you have had, because we did that promotion when we first got the yellow teas in. We just did another promotion for Halloween. It is actually November 1st right now. Gonna date the podcast real quick so that when you're binging it, you can be like, oh yeah, I remember Halloween of 2024. But no, it was really pleasant, but you can kind of see, if you remember in the episode, we have a different take on it. I asked Alex about the history, the origin myth of Junshan Shaozhong, or Junshan Yellow Needle, and he just kind of shrugged it off. He's like, oh yeah, there was an emperor and a concubine, something like that, whatever. And I was thinking about that. I was like, okay, I need to make a reel about this. I need to really get into the history, the mythology of it, and then what we can take out of that mythology. But again, we're different people working together, and this is what I really love about the cooperative, is he has totally different interests. Not totally different, but he has different interests than I do. And so for him, what's most important is Hefeng. What's most important is how can we take, a very rural community of people, and how can we generate income? How can we generate jobs? How can we generate capital to help them, thrive? And so if you've been following us, initially we're like, oh, we'll just buy their teas and then give them the profits from that. But for whatever reason, their teas don't sell as well as, like the Dansong oolongs, as the white teas, as the pu'er teas. Not a lot of people are drinking the green teas out of Hafeng. And so we're trying many different things. Right now, Alex has a lot of comrades from within China out there trying to help him kind of revamp Hafeng in the domestic market. And so they'll be doing a lot of promotions. They're going to create their online store. A lot of cool stuff going on. On my end recently, I actually had some time off. I spent some time in Japan, about 2 weeks in Japan. And initially, I wanted to start sourcing green teas. I was like, if I'm in Japan, might as well start looking at all their green teas. And I got really excited, started doing a lot of explorations, studying that, talked to a few exporting companies, and they're like, yeah, you just like, if you meet a farmer, you can send us their tea, and then we can ship it abroad. And I'm like, great. Sounds awesome. And then we were talking a little more, and they're like, okay, so what country do you live in? I'm like, China. And they're like, oh, let me check. There might be some regulations. And sure enough, they checked, and for whatever reason, there's a soft power thing between China and Japan, where China is not accepting any Japanese teas. Or fruit or food or whatever. They believe it's irradiated, and they need a certain document that doesn't exist. Basically just an under the table trade war going on, where it's just like, yeah, we're not going to accept it. And so they're like, yeah, we can ship anywhere in the world except China. And I'm like, oh, great. And so that kind of like took it off the table for me. Of course, I was like, yeah, sure, I could source it for Tao Teaware, but the focus of Tao Teaware is in the name, teaware. And so anyways, I did get a chance to taste a lot of really nice Japanese teas, and I went to a few different Japanese tea factories, and I have to realize it is very different from sourcing tea in China. Completely different. I mean, I should have expected it. Totally different culture. But I was doing everything that I would do in China, and nothing worked for me. It was, I would show up to Uji, Kyoto, to one of the factories that makes, one of the favorite matchas I've had. And they're like, we are not doing tea tours. You cannot buy any samples. If you want to buy samples, you have to talk to this guy in Okinawa. And I'm like, oh, I'm at your factory right now. You can't just sell me a sample. They're like, nope, it has to go through this specific, retail export or whatever. And so I found that in Japan, it seems like there are a lot more of these proper protocols. You have to follow a certain trend, right? You have to do this step, then this step, then this step. There's a certain contract between this factory and this exporter, and there's no way for me to get around it. In China, it's like, if I'm on the mountain and I've come all this way, they're going to sell me the tea. They're going to let me peek at the factory. But here, even though they had like a factory tour going on at 1 p.m., since I didn't reserve it, 7 days in advance, they wouldn't let me attend. I was just like, okay, yeah, it's a different culture. I have to accept it. But I did eventually get some teas from that exporter in Okinawa. He managed to ship it to my hotel in Kyoto. And yeah, it was interesting because in my experience with Chinese teas, there's so much variety, so much difference, even between one farm and the next farm in the same region making the same tea. The processing equipment's totally different. There's no standardization here in China, it feels like. In Japan, everything's so, as far as the teas I tried, everything seems so incredibly standardized that you're always guaranteed a decent product if you're paying a decent amount of money. My problem here is that there was less adventure, where in Japan it seems like if you spend more money, you get a better tea. If you spend less money, you get a lower quality tea. And it seemed like there was very little wiggle room in that, 1-to-1 ratio, that 1-to-1 kind of linear progression of tea and quality. In China here, of course, look at pu'er. In pu'er, you can get a random village that nobody knows, like it's our Kuashan. and it's really cheap, but the teas are fantastic. I feel like that would be much more difficult to attain in Japan. And yeah, again, like it seemed like a lot of the places in Japan, they were generational tea companies. I would say tea companies because like it seemed like the structure was very much more like there's a CEO and there are workers and they're running a farm. And so it's like the people I was talking to were running the script. They weren't able to take the executive decisions of like, okay, like if you're interested in buying tea, I'll sell you some tea. It's like, no, you have to go through this certain path. But anyways, like I said, it's just a totally different culture, a different sourcing method. And so if you're interested in sourcing Japanese teas, I would highly recommend reaching out in advance, booking appointments, talking to people over emails, and yeah, just showing up on the farm doesn't work as well. And that's just my personal experience. But, maybe somebody has something counter to this. I would love to talk to somebody about Japanese tea on the podcast because I know the basics, right? Like I'm looking at a bunch of samples I have, bunch of different matchas, some gyokuro, some sencha, some kabusu-cha, I think. That's like the almost genmaicha or almost gyokuro that they just shaded at the very end instead of the whole time. Yeah, I got the sencha, I got the kuki cha, I got the hoji cha, which is that really nice roasted green tea. When I went to Uji, everyone was roasting it. It was pretty cool. And I think I'm missing one. Oh, it's the genmai cha, of course. Yeah, the one with like the toasted rice in it. But again, like I really don't know the nuances in those, and I would love to sit down with somebody who really could talk my ear off about it. But in the meantime, they're all good. However, I feel like in the past, Alex and I, we were comparing the gyokuro with the ensure yulu because the kanji and the Chinese characters are the same. It's jade dew. However, drinking gyokuro in Japan, I'm like, this is an entirely different beast, like 100% different. And then also looking at the production methods, even though they're both steamed, even though they both have the same name, gyokuro is shaded the entire time, while sencha is not shaded. And so I would say like sencha would probably be a closer simulacrum of ensure yulu. However, if you remember in the ensure yulu episode, we talk about how ensure yulu was essentially reverse engineered from the Japanese tea production. And so it really is something completely different. This is what's wild about cultural exchange because, this tea technology is initially from China over to Japan, and then eventually it comes from Japan back to China, and at every stage, they create a completely new product, which is, just so cool, where it's like the idea like, don't be afraid of somebody copying you because there's no way they can do it exactly the way you're doing it. And even if they're doing it in their own way, it's going to create something entirely new. And so don't be afraid of being copied and don't be afraid of copying, I think is my takeaway from the ensure yulu and the gyokuro situation here. Now, beyond my experience of getting to Japan and seeing that the Japanese teas are totally different, the sourcing of Japanese teas is totally different, the way the farms are structured, interacting with people, it really started stretching my mind a bit. And I say stretching my mind in that very literal sense. Like, I felt frustrated. I felt like I was learning something new. My mind felt tired every day in Japan. And I've been traveling in China for a long time, living in China, and I've gotten really used to it. I mean, I speak the language. I know how to get around. I know the tips, the tricks, and all of that. When I get to Japan, I really don't know anything. I mean, I get to the airport, and I'm like, okay, like, where's the bus? And then I have to, like, I talk to somebody, they give me instructions to the bus, and it's like this strange, like treasure map. And I have to go through here and find like the kiosk where I buy tickets, and no one's there talking to me. No one's there helping me. And so even just to get from the airport into my hotel, that's already a huge task for me. And for me, I'm speaking all of this because I recently returned to China, to my home, and for the past like 2 or 3 weeks, I have felt like this incredible sense of greater ability. Like I'm realizing things I've never realized. I'm walking by shops that I've never even looked at before. Now I'm seeing them for the first time. I'm reading new signs. I'm like, oh, I didn't know there was a ping pong club here in this area that I walked by 100 times in the past like few months. And for me, this is the manifestation of this neurological term plasticity, right? I listened to the Huberman Lab podcast, which is absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend it. But he's kind of obsessed with neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is really what happens right when you're born. The first like 3 years of when you're born, you're dropped into this world like half baked, and your brain has to learn so much. I mean, you're just a potato for the first 3 years, and then you just learn what you need to survive in this life. I mean, that's one of humanity's greatest skills here, is that from childhood, that's why we spend so long in childhood, that's why we can adapt to so many different situations. And this is essentially the idea of plasticity, where the brain is rewiring itself. And so when you're learning anything like a new language, a new skill, you have this period of frustration where you're testing the edges of your limits, and then eventually you go to sleep and like the neurons rearrange. And the more you do this, the more you enter this state of plasticity, where new connections can be made, new ideas can be learned, new tasks can be learned, but you need this sense of frustration. This kind of goes into as well, like I work out like weightlifting, not like bodybuilding, but just like, making some muscles and stuff. What you have to do is you have to push your body beyond the regular limits, enter this phase of frustration. And then from there, you create this resistance, this frustration, and then your body creates more muscle mass. It realizes it needs to change its way. And I think the way the brain works is this conserves energy, right? If we don't learn anything new, the brain kind of starts like, okay, cool, I can just chill out. I can go to sleep. I can shut this down. I don't need to work so hard. And it just goes from point A to point B, and all of the stuff beside you, like the ping pong club that you walk by every day, disappears. And so this idea of plasticity, when I enter it, I realize like, oh, I'm realizing this, I'm realizing that. Another thing, I'm going all over the place. Another thing that for me really is the marker of I'm entering a state of plasticity is my dreams. I've been having really intense dreams ever since I started traveling in Japan up until now. And for me, I would say traveling is that huge catalyst for me to enter this state of plasticity, but not just traveling in a place that I'm familiar with. It has to be totally different. I mean, like I said, in Japan, I couldn't find the buses. In Japan, like, I would need to find food every day. And that's a huge task. We're just like, okay, like, what's good? Read the menu, order it. How do I pay? Oh, I got this ticket from a machine, give it to a person, and then wait until they're calling. Are they calling me? And then I have to go up and see, and like, it's really interesting, this idea of like learning in order to survive. And I feel like that really flipped my brain on in that state where it's like, oh, you have to learn this or you can't eat. You have to learn this or you can't find your hotel where you're going to sleep tonight. And so that kind of catalyst was really powerful for me to enter this state of, neural malleability, where I'm learning new things. And like I said, like, I've been back in China for like 2 or 3 weeks, and I still have this afterglow where my mind feels way more active than it was before. Now, I know a lot of people say like, oh, traveling is not necessarily the cure to everything in your life. And, I see a lot of people who come to China, and if they have problems back home and they come to China, their problems follow them, right? There's no way to kind of get out of that. But in a means to kind of get yourself out of a slump, out of this state of, not making new memories. Because I also have had experiences of, depression. And those states of depression, for me could last a few months. And I realized one of the big things, obviously I stopped dreaming. Another one is I stopped making new memories and I stopped exploring. And so when I see these things happening in my life, I realize like, oh, like my brain is kind of going into this hibernating mode. And travel for me seems like that really nice stimulus to kind of get me out of it. And I know traveling is difficult. Back in the States, I never traveled because it's so expensive. I mean, I never had the means to really do a whole lot of traveling, and so it does seem like a luxury here. But at the same time, getting into the right places where traveling is easy is also key. I mean, here when I travel in China, if I have to spend more than $20 on a hotel for a night, I'm a little upset. Like the trains, the buses, the taxis, the public transit, it's so easy to get around. Everything's so cheap. I can spend, less than $5 or less than $10 a day on food, $20 on my hotel, and maybe like $30 to $40 on the train ticket. I mean, that frees up a whole lot of potential for traveling. And then also being able to get around for 2 days and then get back for work and stuff like that. I mean, this is a luxury I did not have in America, and I'm so grateful for it. So, anyways, that's just my little spiel on why traveling is so cool for me, and learning that how learning anything can trigger a sense of neuroplasticity. And then, if you do it for 2 weeks, the afterglow lasts for like 4 weeks or something like that, in my experience. But again, it only worked because I know no Japanese. Everything there was brand new to me, and I had to really, really work hard to do anything, from finding my hotel to eating food to interacting with people. Really cool experience. So highly recommend it if you can. If you feel like you need that creative boost, get out in the world, travel, experience, or even push yourself into any unknown territory, anything that creates mental frustration where you need to learn this but you can't. Something like playing piano, an instrument, learning a language, something that just really gets you, frustrates you a little bit. And then your mind realizes, oh, I need to change. I need to adapt. I need to create new paths through this forest of neurology. Anyways, on to the true topic at hand, the Lapsang Souchong. This is the history of Lapsang Souchong, the history of black tea in general, the world's first black tea. And this really doesn't happen until around 1610, which is pretty cool because it seems rather late in the evolution of tea. But if you remember some of my other episodes, kind of the mapping I do, go back to episode 1 and you'll see that it's not until like the Ming Dynasty, Zhuyanzhang, pronouncing all tea should be loose leaf, and then new innovations after the Yuan Dynasty disperses, new technologies, new processing methods, that the old style of tea gets passed through this prism. And through this prism, like the light through a rainbow, you get all of the different spectrum of different types of tea based on their stylistic production methods. And actually, it's exactly at that prism where I want to begin. I just recently did a little reel, which is all about the 6 different types of tea. And so one cool thing about the 6 different types of tea is that they are all classified as colors. This is something I didn't really realize until being here in China and studying Chinese tea in the Chinese manner. They love, the 4 sacred Buddhist mountains in China, the 5 Taoist mountains, the 4 national mountains, these classification of systems. And so having the 6 different colors of tea really suits their style. And so the reason I'm saying this is because there's one type of tea that I didn't really understand the color that would be associated with, and that's oolong tea. And so just to give you guys the overview here, for the 6 different types of tea, you have white, green, blue, yellow, red, and dark. And dark is often also categorized as black. I say dark just to not mislead people because this is not in the West what we call black tea. But those are your 6 styles. Obviously, most of those are self-evident. There's white tea, which is white tea. It's called the same thing in the West. And this is the least processed of all the teas. It's just picked, control withered, and dried. It does have a slightly, it's not fully, the oxidization is not fully stopped, and so it changes over time. The enzymes that cause that oxidization are not fully denatured, and so it will change over time, which is why you can have old white tea and white tea pressed into cakes and it ages. Though if you remember those episodes, that's a more modern take on white tea. Anyways, then you have green tea. Green tea is they pick it, and after just a few hours, they denature that enzyme that causes oxidization. And so this creates really bright, high flavors, but it doesn't really last long. The flavors, start to decline after a few months, and within, after a year, it's a totally different tea, and not in a good way. That third one, blue tea. This is the one that I didn't realize they call blue tea, and it's not necessarily blue tea. I'll get into that here in a second. This is the oolong tea. This is a banfa jiao. Banfa jiao means half fermented, but in the Chinese tea terminology, fermentation and oxidization are the same word. And so they don't mean fermentation here. What they mean, what's actually happening is oxidization. And so here they have the leaves after they're picked, they're withered, kind of handled a little more roughly. And then after several hours, like 12, 18 hours, then the green is killed, and this enzyme that causes oxidization is denatured. But this isn't until the leaves themselves change. The leaves start developing this kind of red edge on the outside, but the bellies are still green. And this is, they call it the banfa jiao, the half oxidized tea. This is blue tea, but I use blue tea as just a common color here. It has a different color in Chinese. It's qing cha. Qing it's a mix between blue and green. It's the color of mountains in the distance, and it's an incredibly prevalent color in Chinese understanding, in Chinese poetry, and Chinese history. In my reel, I kind of mentioned that we don't have a word for this in English, and people are like, oh, it's cyan, it's teal, it's turquoise, it's aquamarine. And I got so many different people saying we actually do have the word for it. This is a side note, and a reminder for myself. When I make reels, I shouldn't do 100% statements. Like, we don't have a word for it in English. If I said we kind of don't have a word for it in English, it'd be okay. But then it's like, you're always, asterisks against every statement you make. It's like, oh, there's always a footnote. Like, don't challenge me on this. But anyways, I didn't necessarily mean we don't have a word, because we obviously do, but it doesn't have the same weight. Like the color qing is so common in Chinese that it's in the rainbow. Like they have 7 colors in the rainbow, and this qing is one of them. The rainbow is the same colors as ours, except they have qing, which is between blue and green, and we have indigo, which is between blue and purple. And so we just add a different step at a different stage in it, which is, in my mind, just totally fascinating. Just these different perceptions of colors and the importance of different colors here and there. But anyways, the qing cha, that's the blue tea. And then after that, I mentioned yellow tea. This is another crazy one that we talked about in the last episode. Exceedingly rare in China. I don't even think it should be part of this 6 different types of tea, just because it's not represented enough. It's really just like green tea with this extra step in it, where you just kind of mung it, you men it, you pile it when it's hot, and it slightly creates off flavors, slightly creates a different texture to it. And it's just not popular enough for me to warrant a whole different classification of tea. And I'll explain this here when we get to dark tea, why I think it should be kicked aside for another type of tea. After yellow tea, I mentioned this is red tea, and that's the tea we're going to talk about today. This is fully oxidized. And so for me, it's like the green tea is loosely oxidized, not really oxidized, ideally very, very little oxidized. Oolong tea, you have this huge range of different types of oolong tea being oxidized at different levels. Red tea is you just let it go. You just fully oxidize it. You don't even kill the green when you're making red tea, which is fascinating. We'll get into this in the next episode when I talk about, or the next 2 episodes when I talk about the making of Lapsang Souchong. I didn't realize you don't have that kill green phase in red tea, and it does make sense. But at some point, I'm like, when is the tea done? Anyways, after red tea, this is when you get that weird one, dark tea. And I differentiate dark tea from black tea, as I said, because it's like, okay, I don't want to confuse people here, but in Chinese it's hei cha. Hei means black. It can also be translated as dark. And this is what I think should be split up into a different category, because dark tea refers to any tea that has this post-production phase of fermentation. And so this is liu bao, this is anhua heicha, and this is cooked pu'er. And in the past, I'm always like, oh, it's just whatever. It's all pu'er. We'll just lump it in together. But no, I think sheng pu'er, pu'er that hasn't been cooked, should be that sixth type of tea. It should kick aside yellow tea because it's a totally different entity that doesn't fit into any of these other 6 categories because it's not post-fermented. It's more similar to white tea where it has this like partial kill green phase that isn't totally complete. And then it ages with time. And so eventually it could turn into a fermented tea or oxidized tea, if you will. Anyways, those are the 6 types of tea. And obviously we're going to be focusing on red tea here and focusing on specifically Lapsang Souchong or Zhengshan Souchong. Now, I know I spent a lot of time just now explaining the different classifications of tea, but I think it's also important to realize that these classifications came after the fact. This is a reordering of the past into a nice little arrangement here. In the history of development of Chinese tea, the teas were just developing. Somebody wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm making a green tea, I'm making an oolong tea, I want to try and make a red tea. They were just making the teas in their region in whatever way. And eventually one style of production became more popular and they started doing that more often. I think this the 6 kinds of tea, we mentioned the top 10 Chinese teas in the past, and it's always kind of a modern looking at the past, a modern view of the past. The first time you see these words is well after the fact that they start actually making them, which I mentioned like the 1610s, we get a date because this is when the Dutch traders began selling or importing the black tea from the Wu Mountains, which is what we'll get into as Tongmuguan. But if you look at as far back as we go, a lot of the texts talking about how to make tea, you get 2 different types of tea styles essentially. This is like Lu Yu's time, the Tang Dynasty, the Song Dynasty, when everything's still being pressed into cakes and powdered and ground and stuff. Really what you have is you have white tea, which is tea that is not made with fire. And that's kind of like the key. It's a sun-dried tea. It doesn't have any processing through steam or through heat or anything. It's all natural. And so people really like this tea for being the most natural. And then you have the other teas, and most all the teas here are being steamed. And so they're probably being picked, they're let, wither down a little bit, and then they get steamed. And the steaming process here is to kill the green and fix the leaves. But with technology being the way it was, with people in different mountains doing things in their own way, you don't have this level of standardization. And so at some times, there's probably going to be different levels of oxidization occurring at different types of teas. And so in my mind, at this time, the Tang Dynasty, the Song Dynasty, this is 700s up to the 1200s. You have tea that's ideally being made as close as you can to green tea. But depending on your skill, depending on the region, depending on whatever, you might get this whole range that dabbles deep into oolong tea. But you don't have anyone that's totally given up yet. That's like, F it, I'm just going to let it go. You don't see that until you get the development of this black tea. And similarly, we'll get into the origin myth of black tea of Zhengshan Souchong because it is similar to the origin myth of pu'er, of the cooked pu'er, where it was a tea that was made in, I think you get like the Qing Dynasty date here. And so the Qing Dynasty is much later. It's like 1600s up to 1900s. And that's when the tea in like the pu'er region in Linsang and stuff is being pressed into cake and then transported all the way by land up to Beijing. And this like many month course in the hot summer heat, poor preservation techniques, a lot of rain, it creates a moldy tea. And through this like molding, you get that post-fermentation production that is mimicked later. And so here we're pretty close to covering all of our bases about tea, even though it hasn't been formally recognized. Up until like in the Qing Dynasty, I think that's when you first get these classification systems. Earlier, though, you have people making white tea. You have people making as close as they can to green tea. You have people making that whole range of oolong teas. You probably have some people making pseudonyms of green tea, something that's close to green tea, but they're leaving it piled right after they steam it. This is what we saw happening in Luan. Luan? Yeah, Luan, and where they're making the guapian. This is in Anhui. They'll make the tea, and then even though it's really, really hot still, they'll just leave it in a pile and kind of let it all cool down, but it's heaped, right? And a lot of other places, they'll spread it out really evenly and let the heat dissipate really quickly. In Luan, they were heaping it up, and the pile would stay hot and warm, and they covered for hours. And so I imagine at this point they're still making, some people are making stuff that tastes like yellow tea, and they just like aren't consciously making yellow tea. Another interesting thing about that is like Luan is very close to Huoshan. I mean, we visited both of them around the same time, and they're both in Anhui. And Luan makes the Luan Guapian, and then Huoshan makes that yellow tea that's very famous, the Huangjin Ya. And so it's maybe not a crazy idea to guess that in that region, people were just piling the tea too much, and then one totally developed in this yellow, classifiably yellow, different, not just green tea kind of taste and flavor. And then you have, the people in Pu'er and Yunnan who are accidentally fermenting teas, and maybe that technology will carry across. But up until, as I mentioned, the 1610s, so this is late Ming Dynasty, right before the 1640 birth of the Qing Dynasty. And as I mentioned, Qing Dynasty, that's when they really finally start classifying the 6 different types of tea. So during the Song Dynasty, when everybody was steaming tea, pressing it, offering it as tribute, grinding it up, powdering it, making like that diancha, which is that, Chinese version of matcha. There's this one place that was really famous for the quality of tea it was making. This is in the Wuyi Mountains in northwestern Fujian. So northeastern Fujian, you have, where they're making the white tea. Southern Fujian, eventually you'll get a lot more of the Anxi, Tieguanyin, a lot of the or more oolongs. Of course, this is where you'll have, essentially it's southern Fujian. It's technically Guangdong, but this is where you have the Chaozhou and the Phoenix Dancong oolongs. But this won't happen until the Ming or the Qing Dynasty. Here we're still in, like 1500s. And as soon as the Ming Dynasty Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang says that all tea should be loose leaf, all tribute tea needs to be loose leaf, it can't be steamed and powdered and pressed into cakes. This is really, supposedly and historically, this is a low point in the Wuyi Mountains, where they invested so much time and energy into making these tea cakes that were very famous, and then all of a sudden the rug gets swept out from under them, and they don't know what to do. Now, the next part in the Lapsang Souchong, the black tea story, you have to understand the geographic significance of this region. So, the mountainous northwest area of Fujian is, like I said, mountainous and very difficult to traverse. You have many consecutive mountain ranges that are difficult to navigate through. And of course, at this time, what you want is the river. You want to travel along the river. It makes everything easier. And where the river is, there's a pass through the mountains. And these passes between mountainous peaks are really strong points militarily speaking. And so you have 2 different provinces. You have Jiangxi, and then you have Fujian. And there's a military base right here in this pass. And the pass in Chinese is Guan, and the village is called Tongmu, right? And so this is where you get Tongmu Guan. It's this mountain pass between Fujian and Jiangxi. And at one point there was a patrolling army passing through, and as tea is being picked in Tongmu Guan, the army, commandeers everything, spends a few days there. All the leaves were picked, and in the facilities, the army comes and just sits up, and they just relax for a few days. Maybe it's raining outside, really not good conditions to dry the tea. I see other stories where the soldiers made beds out of the tea leaves and slept on them, rolled around on them. Of course, this is trying to get the idea of that rolling, that ronian, the oxidization of the tea leaves. However, eventually the soldiers leave, and the farmers left with what, everyone says a ruined yield of tea. But this farmer, since, Wui Wui teas, Tongmuguan teas. They're not fetching the prettiest penny, and he just wants to make it. Whatever. He doesn't have a whole lot of pride in it. So what he does is he's like, how am I going to save this tea? It's totally black. It's totally ruined. It's not drying out. What he does is he finds some pine wood. It's this horsetail pine, which is indigenous to this region and highly guarded. Like, this is, we'll get into it, but this is one of the key things that you're supposed to use when you're making traditionally smoked Lapsang Souchong. And this is why only the teas from Tongmuguan are good for it. And so he uses this specific pine wood, creates a fire, and then puts all the tea leaves on the second floor of his wooden house. You know, it sounds hilarious making a fire in your wooden house, but the bottom floor is, you know, it's a brick, it's stone. This is, you'll see this in northern China, the Kang, where Kang is like, it's a big stone bed, and they'll create a fire underneath the bed. And then people will just sleep on top of the bed that's heated by the fire. And so this is old, like, you know, heated floors. Traditional heated floors, 1500s heated floors. This is what you have. And so he does that, removes some of the stones from the floor, and the smoke comes up. And it steams, dries out all of the leaves. But what it does do is it creates a really smoky taste to the tea. And so the tea is dried out, it's done. He's like, okay, it's good enough, I'll bring it to the market. He brings it into the market, sells it for pennies, and then surprisingly, people really like it. This is like late 1500s. The next year, he makes it again, and people will just start buying it for more and more money until there's a lot of desire, a lot of demand for this tea that's being made in the Tongmuguan region. And eventually, money starts coming into this. Tea is becoming more and more popular, and so what happens through the advent of Zhengshan Xiaozhong, through the accidental creation of this completely oxidized, smoky flavored black tea, the region gets revitalized as far as tea. And so come like the 1600s, they have enough money in the region to start hiring monks from, I think it's the Huangshan monasteries, to come down and teach them how they're making tea. And so the Huangshan monks teach them this songluo method, which is the stir-frying green tea at the time. However, there's still this kind of like lackadaisical, lazy way that they're making the tea, and maybe this, you know, hints at the way they were making their pressed tea before that became so popular, is they're not making it very green. They're letting it oxidize a little too much before they stir fry it, and as I mentioned, this is how you'll get oolong tea. However, getting back to the black tea, this is the most popular thing in the region coming out of the Wui Mountains in the 1600s. And as I mentioned, in the 1600s, what you have is you have the Portuguese coming in through Macau. You have the Dutch coming in, starting to trade, and they get a trickle of this black tea. And at the time, they fall in love with it and they start buying more and more of it. I think I saw a record where it's like 85% of the tea that was being exported at that time all came from the Wui Mountains, all came from Tongmuguan, all just had that Zhengshan Xiaozhong, where Zhengshan means, you know, the right mountain, the formal mountain, the original mountain. It's essentially saying the core region, right? The Zhengshan, and then Xiaozhong is like the little cultivar, the little leaf cultivar. And so it's a specific cultivar from this specific mountain. And this is what gets exported out, and the Dutch start selling and drinking in the Netherlands, and it becomes incredibly popular. And so this is essentially that spread of black tea from China all the way into Europe. And if you want to get specific, it's Queen Catherine, who was a Portuguese princess, married King Charles in 1662, that brought this tradition of drinking black tea, of drinking Zhengshan Xiaozhong, Lapsang Souchong, all the way into England, into the court, into that elite nature, and everyone wants to drink it. It becomes, you know, the biggest thing in England. Anyways, I am much more into the history of tea as it pertains to China. And so like I have very little information about, you know, the stealing of the seeds, its transplanting in India, and the whole espionage that goes on. Maybe I'll talk to somebody who knows about it, because really that's not as much my interest as the ideas of this region through history in the Wui Mountains and Tongmuguan. So, getting back into that, I kind of want to talk about just this word tea, right? This word tea, the word cha, chai, the word zhongshan shaozhong or Lapsang Souchong. Why do I say two different ones every single time? The reason is because of the dialect. Because I lived in Chaozhou for over a year, and they have their own specific dialect, the Chaoan dialect. And then you go over to Fujian, and they have a different dialect. It's the Minnanhua. And there is a slight crossover there for certain words and phrases and how they sound. And so in regular Mandarin, in Putonghua, T is pronounced cha. In Chaozhou, T is pronounced de, like jak de. And then in Minnanhua, it's also pronounced de, te. And so this is where T comes from, this Minnanhua dialect of T, of cha, de. And so the Zhongshan Shaozhong is the Putonghua, is the Mandarin. And then Lapsang Souchong is a transliteration of what the Minnanhua would sound like of Zhongshan Shaozhong. And so I'm literally saying, it's really funny. I'm saying the Chinese Zhongshan Shaozhong, and then I say Lapsang Souchong. And there's a kind of a missing link in there, which is the Minnanhua actual pronunciation of it, which I can't quite honorably do, right? But the closest English approximation is the Zhongshan Shaozhong. I saw a pretty cool map recently about the distribution or the different naming conventions for tea, right? If it's tea or if it's cha. And there are two different ones where it's like, if it comes to your country by land, it's cha. If it comes to your country by sea, it's tea. And this is, you're looking at the different ports here, right? A big port here would be in Fujian and Fuzhou. You have Amoy. Amoy is Xi'an. Xi'an is a port where a lot of the teas from the Fujian region just get funneled down to, and then it gets shipped around the world. This is Portuguese traders, Dutch traders, English traders. Everyone who's getting tea from the sea, they're usually getting it through these ports. And this is usually the Minnanhua dialect that's pronouncing tea as de. And if you're getting it by land, it usually comes inroad through that Silk Road. And you're talking to Chinese merchants who are calling it cha. And so you get chai, you get cha. That's a really cool historical spread of why there are these two different things. And I think you really just have to understand how different the dialects are in China. It's really funny. Like, a lot of people here in China, the old timers, they'll speak their own dialect so thickly that it's hard for them to communicate. Like the old granny who lives in my apartment complex, I can't understand a single word she says, but she'll do things like point to her mouth, point to her stomach, and ask me a question. I'm like, oh yeah, I've eaten, thank you, grandma. Because that's a very common greeting. In Chinese, like, 你吃饭了吗? Have you eaten? But a lot of times, if I have a taxi cab driver that I don't understand what they're saying, they will write the word down on their hand. And this is, at first when I got here, I'm like, I don't understand you. Why are you writing imaginary characters on your hand that I can't even see? And like, do you think that's going to help me? But really what this does do is, despite the different dialects in China, the written language remains the same. In ancient times, the written language was sacred. You can't just write something down and throw it away. Every written piece of scrap needs to be treated properly because the language is the glue that holds the culture together. And so that's where a country can have hundreds of different dialects. The people speaking to each other can't understand each other, but the language, the written language, needs to be totally understandable by everyone. And this is really cool. This is why when I first started studying Chinese, I did not like the simplified Chinese characters, because traditional Chinese characters existed until the 1950s in almost the same way. I mean, you get the different scripts, right? How the characters change over time. But for 2,000 years, Chinese characters remain largely the same. And then in the last 50 and last 60, 70 years, they just changed everything. And so for me, that seemed like such a loss when I was learning classical Chinese and I'm reading stuff from, 200 AD, and I can read every character. And I can look at it, how it was written on like the bamboo slips, and understand a majority of it. What has changed is the grammar. But even so, this is like the ancestor to the modern Chinese grammar. And I can look at the classical Chinese and get a deeper understanding on why the grammatical structures in the present work. But now it's like, after living here and studying so much modern Chinese, the simplified Chinese, I've lost a lot of that touch with the classics. And so this is the really clever thing that was done, where you teach everyone this written language and then you just let them speak whatever they want, right? You standardize your weights, you standardize your measurements, because this is essential for economy, for trading, right? You don't want somebody's gold pieces to be worth less than yours if you're in the same country. But once you do that, then you standardize the language, everything just works out much better. But the reason I'm talking about this is, even though there's this perceived difference in cha and tea, if you're reading Chinese, it doesn't change. It's the same exact character. So too with Lapsang Souchong and Zhengshan Xiaozhong. If you're looking at the Chinese, these two will be written in the same way. They're just pronounced differently. And so if you read the language, there's no misconception here. But if you're hearing it, it sounds like two different things. And so if you ever hear that, the irony is that it literally means the same thing. So this is around, late 1500s, early 1600s, when you get the world's first black tea. But you don't get the word black tea until mid-1600s, until the Qing dynasty, until they start classifying teas in these different styles. This is when you get the 6 different types of teas, when they start really differentiating themselves. And I think this is, a really important takeaway when you're looking at history, when you're looking at the past, when you're looking at even the history of your own life. Like, as humans, we love to apply narratives to things. We love this idea of retrospect, where everything makes sense in the future, and I must have been doing it in order to do this. But in reality, one action leads to the next. One situation causes this thing to arise, and there's a whole lot of chaos, a whole lot of chance. And then we look back on it and we apply this well-ordered narrative to it, which is misleading. It's a lie. That's not how things happen. It's not like somebody was like, I want to make a new tea. It's black tea. Okay, did it. It's just like things happen and then we slot them in. Speaking of language, this is my idea of like the Chinese tones, right? A lot of people know there are 4 different Chinese tones, maybe 5 if you count the untoned. But yeah, there's ma, 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 ma. I think I did that right. The first one's a high singular. The second one is rising. The third one is a dip. It goes down and comes back up. And the fourth one is just a downward kind of pitch. But the idea here, my idea when I was learning Chinese and learning the tones from a book and then hearing somebody speak it, it feels like 2 different words. It feels like the systematic classification of tones obviously came after the fact. Like, at first you have a living language, and then somebody is like, okay, we have to write this down. We have to think about this in a different way. And then they, create this idea of tones. They start lumping things together just based on the way they sound. Anyways, there's a lot of stuff that we take for granted. It's like, oh, that is the way it is. But really it's a retroactive discovery of the way things evolved. And so this kind of gets into that plasticity idea I was talking earlier on. When getting into the creative process, a lot of times what you really have to do is you have to stop thinking about how this fits into that. You have to stop thinking about why. You have to stop thinking about what good will this do, or what do I want to do, what do I want to achieve. You just do it. You follow it. You create something new that you enjoy. And then after the fact, you look back on it, and then you put it into place. Then you put it where it belongs. And so if we didn't have this kind of freedom, without these kind of specific yellow tea, white tea, black tea, green tea, red tea, oolong tea, pu'er tea, dark tea, you have people making tea to whatever methodology they want. Now, I guess to do a little devil's advocate there on my own thinking, I know everyone's brain is different. People are wired differently. People work differently. And sometimes having that retrospective grid of these are the different classifications, you see a hole. You see a missing link that you can fill. Like, we have all these teas, but no one's actually fully oxidized it yet. And so what if I did that? And so there can be discoveries, creative processes that come after classifications, but I'm really into that organic growth and development and evolution of it, which kind of led to somebody who just, went a little crazy through accident or through intention and let the tea totally oxidize, let the tea totally ferment, if you will, and created something incredibly novel. And this is the tea that gets exported to the West, and I have some more ideas on why it is, because if you make a tea that, depending on your processing, still has some active enzymes in it, is exposed to moisture, is exposed to the sea through 3 months of traveling in open seas, you're going to end up with a tea that's very, very different from the tea you started with. But something like black tea, where it's already at that finishing point, already at that ending point, like it can't oxidize any more than this, you have a tea that's relatively stable from when you drink it in China to when you drink it in Europe. And so this is why black tea usually is the easiest exported, especially in ancient times. And so kind of the idea of green tea is a little secret in China. All the different teas are, the Chinese teas, and what gets exported is black tea. Maybe it's because of the taste, but maybe it's also because of the stability of it from, China all the way into the West. So as I mentioned, the Qing dynasty hits, and you get everyone just going crazy about tea, about black tea. A lot of different countries coming in, trying to buy as much as they can. I mentioned the Qing dynasty. I mentioned the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English. And eventually, you will have to get into the Opium Wars. And the Opium Wars, I would love to get somebody who knows a lot more about it than I do. But really what it comes down to is, the Western powers trying to get goods out of China, and then China kind of realizing like, hey, we have all the materials we need. We don't need a lot of these, imported gadgets and stuff like that. We have silver, we have tea, we have material resources, but China has something that the West doesn't have, and that's tea, right? And so no amount of silver from England can buy the tea that they need. And so they create something else, What other thing that China doesn't have that the West has? Oh, it's opium. And so they're using that to kind of, buy the tea and stuff like that. Anyways, I'm not a very big into the Opium Wars, but that really is where this history of black tea leads. Opium Wars, espionage, the stealing of the seeds. But for whatever reason, that's not my cup of tea. In the next episode, I'm gonna close out my history of black tea for now. We can put an ellipses, but I would like to get somebody else on the podcast that knows much more about that side of history than I do. However, what I do want to do is in the next episode, I'm going to talk about sourcing my time sourcing tea, Lapsang Souchong, in the Wuyi Mountains, in Tongmuguan, in the village of Masu, meeting Beibei and the Zhangs and the 5 generations of the Zhangs. I think I met 3 generations of Zhangs all up there making tea, and Beibei is the youngest one, and her father is teaching her the traditional methods, while her grandfather is making the Shingongyi methods. And so if you've had any of the Masu tea, the Masu cinnamon, that's made by Grandpa Zhang, and then the Masu pinewood, that's made by Beibei and her father, and that's the traditional tea. Really cool that they're still making it. But anyways, I'll get all into this in the next episode. A few things I want you to remember for that is that mention of horsetail pine, a specific type of pine that's indigenous to the Tongmuguan region that is essential for making true Tongmuguan Lapsang Souchong, and why it tastes different if you get it from a true Tongmuguan source and not. And also there's that slight line I'll get into later in the next episode where it's actually, you can't sell it, you can't buy it, you can't sell it, it's technically illegal, and so you kind of have to have a secret reserve of it if you really want to use it. Anyways, another thing I want you guys to remember is that Tongmuguan strategically is located, it's a pass between 2 provinces, between Fujian and between Jiangxi. And since, for the past 500, 600 years, maybe even more, it's had a military occupation, occupied military zone, where this is a place you want to occupy because it's a place of power. This is the easiest route between these 2 provinces. The easiest route probably for hundreds of miles in either way, or at least, dozens of miles in either way. It's a pass through the mountains. And so you control that, and even to this day, it's difficult to get into. So I'll get into that in the next episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode on the world's first black tea. I'm sorry I skated over a lot of the European stuff, but again, I'm sticking to my Chinese side. So again, this is Derek from One Over Tea. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tea Soup. And until next time, guys, brew happy.